I think that one of the most fulfilling things for me, kind of leaving the big corporate world and starting a business, is pretty much every night at the end of the day, I actually know what I accomplished. You know what I mean? Like there are things I can point to that I completed and I'm like, oh, I did that thing, or we did something valuable for the world today.
Welcome to Vibecast, the podcast that dives deep into the heartbeat of workplace culture. I'm your host, Kristi Skutvik. Join me in conversations with extraordinary leaders as we unravel their experiences, both positive and negative, that have impacted workplace culture. This podcast is more than storytelling. It's about actionable insights. Are you ready to transform the vibe at your workplace? Let's go. Today, I'm speaking with Steve Perkins. Steve is the CEO and founder of Greenhouse Coaching. Greenhouse is a scalable consultancy working with both individuals and teams to maximize performance, engagement, and positive collaboration. The way Steve sees things is that every person has a purpose, but all too often they're unsure how to reveal that purpose and how it should ultimately connect with their strengths to be a driving factor in their work. Steve likened the process to nurturing seeds. Having worked one summer at a greenhouse, he learned that growth can't be forced, only nurtured. The potential for greatness and thriving is already in that seed locked up. And never for even a minute that summer did he spend time and effort trying to pull the potential out of the seeds. Instead, he just worked on the environment. Similarly, you can't force people to do their best work. Instead, your effort should go into cultivating the right environment, and people will naturally thrive. Steve, thanks for being here today. I have enjoyed our conversations up to this point. I just think the good conversation always leads to like an idea or something creative or like something inspirational. So I'm really excited for you to be here today, for you to share more of your story with other people and really talk about like good vibes, because you've got a lot of cool things going on. And yeah, I'm just excited for you to share with the world.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here too. The first time we ever talked, you shared a definition that I absolutely loved and I've been using. So you said something to the effect of basically how people would describe their work and their workplace to their friends. And that really defines the culture and the vibes in a very real and authentic way. And I just loved that because I know we've talked about Aaron Dignan's Brave New Work and some of these kind of books where we know that culture is made up of beliefs and behaviors and how teams and people interact. But I feel like that stuff's so hard to know what to do with in the day to day. And so I love that your definition just kind of brought it down to earth. Like the way that you talk about it or explain it to your friends, that is so much of what the vibe is at work or in an organization. So I stole that one, but I did think, okay, Steve, you're the guest. You got to say something. What I tend to tell teams and leaders is we talk about these things called team norms. And you and I can get into this later, but team norms are the practical everyday rhythms that actually create the vibes of your work and your organization and your dynamic. And so I really like the idea of team norms because they bring it down to earth. And it's these very simple rhythms and routines that actually define and start to create how we all interact and experience each other.
Definitely. It's like how you go about the day to day. And I always like to say like the micro moments, and those are what matter. And those are what create like series of those micro moments that are norms kind of create the energy and the feeling and the vibe of people and how they interact and set precedent too, right? Of like when new people have a tendency to follow the flow versus create their own. So
yeah. And it's funny because we have these things in our normal everyday life, but sometimes we don't make the map from there to work. Like I was realizing this morning, I have this new norm. I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but I seem to end every night with closing all the blinds in the house, which it's dumb. It takes way too long. And then in the morning, the first thing I do is open them all up. I'm like, why am I closing and opening and closing and opening? Like,
maybe there's a significance there, like closing down your day and opening up your day to start fresh. I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe it has some deeper meaning. But yeah, it's the norm. It's a pattern that it does start to shape how the night ends and how the morning feels. And for example, in my marriage we realized in the morning we were just kind of like rushing and doing our thing. And we never, we would just blow past each other. So we tried to have coffee and actually chat for a minute. And that is a norm that is hopefully for the better shaping our relationship versus the norm of just kind of doing our own things in our own lanes. It's these little, you're right, the little repeatable micro moments.
Yeah. And translate that to the workplace, right? Imagine like just pausing for a minute because we're in these, virtual hallways, if you will, of like passing from one call to the next and maybe like taking a quick bio break in between, or maybe not, maybe grabbing a snack, maybe not. But imagine if we just paused or scheduled a Zoom to have virtual coffee with somebody. If you are in a virtual environment, like what connection that might create or how that might actually make your day more productive and just overall better in general. So lots of things we can do if we just take a minute to think through the action versus just doing the thing. So walk me through, I like to start out with understanding your journey, right? And what got you to where you're at today, and not, a run through of your resume and experience, but really the journey that you've had in learning how to, like what to do, what not to do in creating good work vibes, and understanding who you are to create those for your clients, for your team. And then I'd love to understand, for the future, what you're doing and some of the creative things that you've come to know or come to be that you feel are really going to change the vibes of the workplace.
Well, okay, you and I are the same. We could go on forever, so you have to rein me in. But I had a great leader, a manager at kind of a bigger corporate environment that I worked at. And he said something that stuck with me. He said, you care about the individual more than the organization. And I said, no, I don't. I'm all about like building great company culture. That's my thing. And he said, no, you don't. You care about culture because it's made up of a bunch of individuals and their stories. And it was one of those kind of almost emotional moments like, whoa, that was really deep. But he was spot on. He hit the nail on the head, and I had never seen that. I think from a young age, I always thought a lot about and cared about, like, what do I want to be when I grow up? And what do you want to be when you grow up? And I love those conversations about purpose and meaning. And then fast forward to like career life, and I cared a lot about organizational culture. And I thought those two were different ideas that competed. And then when this leader shared this with me, I realized, no, they're one and the same. I care so much about organizational culture because A, spend so much of our day, and B, it's made up of a bunch of individuals trying to live out their purpose and their calling. And so that's what I believe in, is an organization that invests in individuals to be at their best and shine. And that makes a great whole. So it's kind of weird that that's where it started for me. But I didn't put it together until this person said it to me. I don't know about you. I always wrestled for years and years with like, what do I want to be when I grow up? I never knew the answer to that question. And I thought, this was the worst question. Who knows this? And so it made me mad. I thought it was a bad question because I was just frustrated with not being able to answer it. But I think that has led over time to getting more clear on what I'm meant to do, and then realizing I wanted to help others figure that out for themselves. So yeah, it's kind of always been this story of like purpose, individual purpose, and collective culture.
How did his leadership style shine through? And then what did you see in the vibes of the group as he led that group?
I'll give a political answer because I think that was the good side of the coin. And the flip side is what started turning on the light bulb for me. So I had my first real job out of college. I was a mechanical engineer, and I worked at this company in Michigan. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was 2008, the auto collapse, and being a mechanical engineer was kind of the worst case scenario. The people who graduated the year before me were getting all these offers from all these big companies, and I had like none. And so I finally landed a job at this small high-tech startup, and they were doing some really cool and interesting work. Very, very interesting stuff with like particle accelerators and really high-tech things. But as a result of that whole situation, the culture was really, really toxic to the point where my health was deteriorating. My relationships, I was newly married, and that was already really struggling because my job was so taxing. The year I left, it was 100% turnover at the company, to give you a sense of how bad it was.
What did toxic look like?
Yeah, I like that question because I do think that word gets thrown around and it can be varying degrees. This was on the higher end of the toxicity spectrum. And so there were a lot of illegal things. There's still court cases going on for things that were happening in the office. But what I realized later was what actually made it the most toxic were not the big like headline things. It was the small, everyday kind of eating away at you or beating you down a little more and a little more through the way the interactions happen. So let me give you an example. The CEO, it's a startup. So even as a lower level person, you got to interact with the CEO. And I was kind of a project manager. And so I remember this one day where he came in, he said, "Hey, this important project, you need to go travel to Indiana to this supplier and like oversee this stuff. And here's the 3 things you need to do." And I'm, little achiever. I'm like, got it. I've written down the 3 things. I'm off and I'm on my way. And I execute them to the best of my ability and I do the things. And then I come back from the trip and he calls me into his office, which funny enough, it was in an old school building. And so his office was the principal's office. And so I walk in all nervous, cold sweat, shaking in fear of what's going to happen because it was always something bad. And he wasn't mad. He wasn't raising his voice, anything like that. But what he said, he was like, "All right, did you do the things?" I said, "Yeah." And I explained what I did. And he said, "I didn't tell you to do that." And, so I'm frozen. So I don't really say what I should say. But in my head, I was like, "Yeah, you did. I wrote them down as you were talking. And here's the sheet where I wrote them down." And he's like, "I didn't tell you to do that. Why'd you do that?" And suddenly it's this attack and you're just frozen and you don't know how to respond. And he continues the attack until, sometimes he would do this in front of everybody and throw a chair across the room. It was so deteriorating. Every day there was a little more and a little more kind of shutting you down. And I would wake up every morning nervous and shaking to go into work that day because what's going to happen today? What little thing is going to beat me down a little more today? And so that's kind of what the toxic in that situation often looked like.
You must have felt like you were crazy, right? You're like, no, hold on. I wrote it down. Like, I wish I had something to record you saying these things. And now you've somehow convinced yourself of something else. And am I nuts? Am I hearing voices in my head?
Yeah. In fact, fast forward to when I quit and I actually bought a pocket recorder and I did record the conversation because I knew he wasn't going to treat me well and was probably going to do some illegal maneuvers. And sure enough, he did. And I had it on recording. So it was.
Oh, wow.
It's not funny, but I guess I kind of laugh about that because it was so ridiculous looking back. Like now you and I, as people who work on making work a place where we thrive and enjoy, it's like, it was so ridiculously bad that I just can't even believe I was in that.
Well, and I always question, like, why? Why does it have to be like that? Like, why does somebody feel compelled to do that to another person? Like, why? What is behind that? I mean, I was probably so annoying to my parents growing up because I was probably asked why 400 times in a day. I still do it now, right? It's like, why do we need to do that? And I'm sure you put that in your mental notebook to say, like, I will never do something like that to somebody else because I remember the feeling like it was yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's what led to wanting to work on company culture, actually, because I always had the personal purpose thing, like helping people figure out what to be when they grow up. And then I left there to go to Capital One, which had a great company culture. And those 2 experiences back to back made me realize, I kind of turned on the light bulb that I really care deeply about leadership and culture, and I want to help create great ones. And now I know what not to do. I had the list of what not to do.
It's like just as important to know what to do as what not to do, right? Because sometimes there's unintended consequences of something that lead to the what not to do. So you have to be super aware of those as well.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about what made it so great. Like, give me a tangible observation that you had or tangible experience you had at Capital One that leads you to continue to say, which I think is amazing, after you've left, you're still talking about what the culture is like, which says a lot about what they've done. So Tell me a little bit more.
Okay, 2 things off the top of my head, because you and I have talked about them both. One is they made you feel important and your ideas mattered. Now, it is a big corporation, so there are plenty of times where you didn't feel that way. And I think that's just the nature of a giant company. But in general, they did a great job of that. It's an innovative culture. You get to raise your hand and share your ideas, and you get to actually try a lot of things. Now, that has downsides too, because sometimes it's hard to make decisions when it's a culture where everyone can have ideas. But you and I have talked about how important that is to feel important and heard. And I think I immediately felt that, and in contrast to that place I was at before.
And did you see some of your ideas get implemented? Is that how you knew you were heard? Because it's one thing to talk, but like in my mind, I always say vibes speak louder than words. So like you could say all these things and do all these things, but was there really like action behind it and a result that you saw after you had an idea that made you believe in your heart that your ideas mattered?
Yeah, I know. It's a good question, because I think this is one of my gripes that made me eventually want to leave the corporate world. Is the nature of the beast is it is hard to get anything done. You end up meeting about meetings and emailing about emails, and I'm a doer. Like if I have a good idea, I want to try it now and see the results. And so eventually, to me, I had to go be in a smaller environment. But yeah, toward my end of my time there at Capital One, I started a culture team that we were working on transforming the culture of the organization. And it wasn't like I don't say culture team as in like planning fun events. It was my full-time job, and I recruited a team of people who our full-time job was to transform the culture and create great work vibes. And that started as an idea I had where a leader believed in me and gave me the runway to try it. And, long story short, it became even my runway to try some of the ideas of the company I have now. And did it all get fully implemented? No, because there's org changes and there's all kinds of shifts that just like, of course, we can never follow through on an idea, but we did for like 2 years get to do it and make a positive impact and learn a lot ourselves. So yeah, I think it was like looking back, that part is really cool and impressive as a big company. I also think there were norms, and we can talk about these practically in a minute, but things like one-on-ones between a manager and the person they manage. And I've come across now as a coach and a consultant, so many companies who don't even know what this idea exists, let alone do it. I'm sure you have too. And they did it consistently. It was just an expectation. You would meet once every other week or so with your manager and have an hour to chat. Now, a lot of managers didn't use that time well, and that's part of what I've tried to improve since. But yeah, at least they were trying to create that space to invest in people's growth and to let you be heard and have feedback. And I think that was positive learning.
Yeah. Talk to me about some of the other norms. Maybe we shift forward now in your current organization and what you practice with some of your clients. But what do those norms look like that you are true to your core and you discuss every time you're in a conversation with somebody about building these vibes of an organization?
Okay, well, we can go back and forth because I know you have a lot of thoughts on this too. I like some of the most practical ones that actually aren't that exciting to talk about, but then you try them and they are the most exciting thing that you do at work. I would probably name 3 top ones. We implement it with every organization. We do it ourselves at Greenhouse. And one of them is called weekly sprint planning. The second one is called calendar blocks. And the third one, like I mentioned, is one-on-ones, but specifically how to use them for feedback, delegation, and development. And so these are the things that don't sound that sexy on the surface, but when they're done consistently, it's actually what makes work fun because it's meaningful and it's working. It's not dysfunctional and you actually are getting stuff accomplished. Like, I think that one of the most fulfilling things for me, kind of leaving the big corporate world and starting a business and being an entrepreneur, is pretty much every night at the end of the day, even if it was a frustrating day, I actually know what I accomplished. You know what I mean? Like, there are things I can point to that I completed and I'm like, oh, I did that thing, or we did something valuable for the world today.
I think it's about impact, right? What we have talked about is like, we came into this world wired the way we're wired with these aspirations to have an impact on the world far greater than we believed we could have inside a large corporation, which drove the entrepreneurial spirit to do something more, right? And every day is hard. And it's like your highs are really high, your lows are really low, right? But you know that even in those low days, the direct impact you can have on even one person, driving them to do something better for themselves or the organization that they serve is far greater than checking off a task from a task list, right?
Yeah. And I think some of these kind of practical norms are what make that stuff possible and what create a good vibe because you're communicating better with each other and seeing each other. Would it be helpful to like explain a bit about each or?
Sure. I liken it to like building a beautiful house. It's probably because I just got off of my house being redone and it was very, very, very challenging. But it's like you have to have like the good bones and infrastructure. And these three things that you talked about, like how I'm visualizing it is these are like building the infrastructure in order to build this beautiful culture, right? And so if you don't have the infrastructure, then nobody really knows how the house is built or where to walk. And so everyone takes a different path.
I love that. That's so good. I'm writing that down. Okay, let me give like a quick, for anyone who's curious about these, like enough color to the painting that they can go run with it. The weekly sprint planning, I kind of steal the name from Agile development methodology because I think they do some of these rhythms well. Essentially, it's just a block of time, call it 1 or 2 hours every week, where either you individually or as a core team of people plan the following week. And I like to break it into 3 parts. The first is celebrating wins and kind of documenting what you learned that week. So just saying, oh, this was a win. Here was something that I learned. And then naming like, what's your main thing for next week? Only one thing. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. And then the third part is just setting aside a chunk of time the following week to do that main thing. Because we often name an intention and then we don't get around to it because of all the urgent firefighting going on. And so we block off time. And what I often have people do is do your sprint planning on Friday because most people plan on Monday, but then it's too late. You've already ruined the best, most productive day of the week. You come in Monday and you're still like, well, I'm not even sure what I should be doing today. So I really like planning on a Friday, or if you have to, a Thursday. And then you can rest easier on the weekend and hit the ground running Monday. And Monday morning is where I like people to put that deep work, focused block of time to work on their main thing. And so you see already how, okay, not the sexiest thing, but look how already you're more productive, you're more focused, and you're actually less stressed than ever before. And I often find after that Monday block, it feels like I've accomplished more than I typically do in a whole week. And so you feel this kind of mental momentum of, oh, now I can go get a bunch of stuff done. I've done the important thing that usually never get around to it.
Yeah, it's like setting the intention and being purposeful with your time. So how often we're just like, I find this even with my kids, I'm just like running them from place to place to place to place to place. And then all of a sudden we're like sitting at home and we're like, what just happened? Versus looking at the calendar, planning it out, knowing that that block of time is going to happen. And then personally setting intention of like the conversations I want to have or what I want to observe. And the sky looks pretty tonight and this and that and the other, right?
I just finished leading a strategic planning offsite for this leadership team, and they decided to implement that. And yesterday I got a call and the CEO, she said, well, this just doesn't work because there's so many things. I can't choose one thing. There's so many things. And I said, yeah, I get it. There's always so many things. But the point is you can't get so many things done in a week, but you can get one. And so if you pick out one, even if it's arbitrary, pick one and complete it. Now you've completed something, and that's valuable in and of itself, but it also is like a brain hack on yourself and gives you more energy.
Definitely. Okay, talk to me about one-on-ones then. So I'm so curious because there's so many flavors of this, but you are very specific about feedback, delegation, and development, and including that in one-on-ones. So talk to me about the act of doing it and then the impact that it has.
All right. And I want your honest reaction to this because I intentionally strip it down to keep it simple, but I know as a result, it misses some things. So the way I do it and advise others to do it is to have, let's call it every other week, you and I would have a one-on-one. It'd be like an hour of time set aside. It's important. We don't push it off. Like we actually stick to it. And the focus is not status updates on the work. So we're shifting from that because that's kind of the easy thing to do at that time. And we're trying to shift it to being developmental and focus. So what we're going to do to keep it simple is talk both ways, me to you and you to me, about what's one thing that's working well and what's one thing that's not working well. And that's like our foundation. Because I think there's all these books and theories and it gets so complicated that you get into a one-on-one and you're like, I don't have time to prep for these. And now I avoid them because I don't know what to talk about. And then so we just talk about status updates. And I find that having something very simple that works, like this has worked for me and others for years. It just, what's one thing that's working well and one that's not, I share to you and you share to me. And let's say like, even if you're my manager, I still am also sharing that feedback with you because that creates this safety and trust that, hey, we can talk about things and it goes both ways. And so as the leader, then instead of you defending yourself or fighting back, your posture would be like, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to work on that. Or tell me more about that, because then it reassures me that it is okay to share feedback with you. And I think when it goes both ways and it's consistent over time, then the bigger stuff's not so scary to talk about because we've been in the rhythm of talking about things before they're big problems.
Have you encountered a leader that you've worked with that is just highly resistant to this? And I don't want their feedback. It doesn't really matter what they say. Or, I just thinking of leaders I've worked with before that just really don't care, or they come off as they don't care. Can you share like maybe a small experience that you've had with a leader like that? And if you had a breakthrough with them, how?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because as a coach, you dig in a little deeper and you find pretty much every time it's not resistance to the idea. It's just fear of upsetting someone or having a difficult conversation. And especially for leaders who care, there's a certain amount of people pleaser that comes with that. They don't want to deliver bad news or hurt your feelings. And what's so ironic about it is it's actually not true. Most people actually love getting constructive feedback because they want to be better and they want to know how they can get better. It's all in how it's delivered. And so the worst thing is, I think what happens a lot in big corporate environments that creates bad vibes is stuff builds and builds. And then once a year or maybe twice a year, you get a big laundry list of your no-nos and it's too late to do anything about it. And that just feels dehumanizing. Like now I can't improve on that. It's too late. It's after the fact versus if you shared with me along the way, hey, here's something that didn't work so well. Like, let's talk about how to make it better. I want to know that. I want to get better.
Yeah. It's like, I love this idea of keeping things super simple. It's just like what I live by. And I feel like the world that we're in, because of all the inputs that we have, the outputs, people somehow correlate like, because the inputs are complicated and lots of them, that the outputs have to be complicated and there have to be lots of them. But I really think if we just get back to the basics of good, authentic communication in real time right now without getting somebody's approval or doing this or doing that or doing this before, and then all this time passes by, I agree. It's just, we have to kind of think of like how we handle our kids of like, hey, don't do that. What are you doing? Tell me why you're doing that.
Right
like
in the moment.
And we've gotten so far, not all companies and not all leaders, but many have gotten so far away from that because there's all these inputs of tools that we've introduced, I'll say, and we're forgetting to think.
Yeah, because all the tools are basically procrastinating, just communicating well. It's like, well, it's too hard to say that to your face, so let me say it through a tool.
Or like I have to analyze it one more time with it in a different way in order to see if I see it differently from this angle. It's like, no, just see it for what it is. Keep it simple, have the conversation and move on, right?
Yeah. Do you find, because I know I still find it difficult sometimes, and yeah, you're just busy and you don't necessarily want to share feedback, whether it's positive or negative, but how do you get over that hump? Like for me, I think it does help to have these rhythms on the calendar so it doesn't go too long without communicating in that two-way street. But even in the moment, like, do you find there are things that help you to just say the thing?
Yes. I mean, I'll write it down on paper and then reread it or write it in an email. I won't send the email, but just so I can I'm very visual. The older I get, the more I realize how visual of a learner I am or of a decision maker I am. So I need to think about it and then see it. And when I see it, and a lot of times I'll talk it through with my husband if he's around, hey, how did this come across? Or should I change this word here? I'll do that sometimes if it's really big feedback to deliver. But I find that the more you address something in the moment, the less amount of times you have to address something that's bigger, right? Because you're getting at the core of it very quickly in those micro moments. I'll use that term again. So if it's you see something and then you say something, and I use text a lot, or I'll make a quick phone call or a video text just to deliver the information if it can't be two-way communication, and then set some time aside to talk about it. I also think it's super important to know the person that you're delivering the information to, right? So I can be very direct. Some people don't like that directness. It tailspins them. And so if you know the personality traits of the other person, I think you can think through how would they want to hear it? Because communication's in the listener. It's not in me delivering the words.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that's a pretty typical practice in coaching, I'll always in the first session ask the person, how do you like to get feedback or thoughts or observations? And if they don't really know how to answer that, give them examples well, it could be softer or very direct. And it's funny how often people say direct, by the way. I think because they're tired of not really knowing what people are thinking. But yeah, I think we can overcomplicate it. Even with that, if you're in doubt, just ask. You don't have to be an expert on personality. Just ask, hey, how do you like to receive thoughts and opinions and feedback? And then hear them out.
And I'm a really big fan of Covey's 7 Habits, and speaking to understand, I think is if I had to pick one out, that has been so helpful in my own personal life and professional life of just getting the perspective of the other person before you try to impose something on them, right? So sometimes people feel feedback is imposed versus given as a generous gift. And so if you seek to understand kind of the perspective of where they were coming from, it might help guide the feedback. So just take that as if there's one thing that you can do right in the moment is help me understand why, what's their why driving it? And then it might help shape the conversation, right? Or deliver it a little bit softer, maybe direct, but in a kind way.
Yeah, and that's another good reason for a rhythm and a norm of one-on-ones that are already on the calendar, because sometimes in the moment, if emotions are too high, it's not a good time to share something, and it's better to kind of plan your words and come back to it. But the other thing I'll say about one-on-ones, because it does get, so that rhythm works, guaranteed. I've seen it so many times. What's one thing that's working and one thing that's not? And you just make it a rhythm, and it's not scary or difficult when you just make it a rhythm. But that can get tiring to always have this feedback going on. So I like to intersperse 2 other things you mentioned, the delegation and the development. So one-on-ones are a great place to delegate. And I use a really simple 3-step process of it's all about delegating the thinking. It kind of gets over the hump of people worrying that people are going to mess it up or them being worried of getting it wrong. It's just let them start with thinking and owning it, and you work through it from there. But that's a good place in the one-on-one to talk through that stuff, because again, you're not rushing past it. You have enough time to process, to check for understanding. Okay, say it in your words. Let's make sure we're on the same page. And then same with development. There's just some simple, good coaching questions that you can ask someone you manage, for example, to help them figure out what they're good at, what they love doing, where they could focus more or less in their role. And they feel invested in. I mean, it's the number one thing people want in their work right now is just to be invested in. So I love to bring that into those one-on-ones.
Okay, so if there's one thing people could walk away with today after our conversation, and you say, if you do nothing else, go do this one thing and go do it now, what is the one thing?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, you just gave 3 really good ones, but sometimes people get overwhelmed by that. So what's the one piece of advice or the one quote or the one mindset that people should have? What is that one thing?
I always struggle with these kind of questions, but I do think I'd go back to where I started, that team norms are the practical realities of day to day that create the vibes. And I think whether it's any of the ones we just talked about or something different, like set a time on your calendar, like pause the podcast right now, set a block of 30 minutes on your calendar this week sometime to just simply take a walk and think about what is a norm that I want to implement, either with my team or personally, that would give me that space and that cadence to focus on what matters. And so if you don't know, then maybe that's the place to start, is think about what matters right now and give yourself the space to think about that. I think that would be it.
And block your calendar to do it, right?
Block your calendar. I'm telling you, it's all about the calendar blocks.
Game changer.
I do think it's real. Like all this vibes stuff, it's invisible. It doesn't occupy space in our lives. And so that's why I have become obsessed with calendar blocks, because it's what makes the invisible tangible. It's like all this squishy stuff we talk about lives somewhere and it happens.
It is. I mean, I have a whole podcast around building good work vibes and talking to guests about it and like uncovering what it is, because it is a little bit squishy and invisible and yet so important. And so what are the like tactics and key things that create that? I love making the invisible visible. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, we all listen to talks or go to conferences and we get excited because we already believe that this is the important stuff. I don't think anyone listening to this podcast needs convincing that this is the important stuff. The problem is our intentions don't match reality because we're busy and distracted. And so that's why I think I like these practical things that make our intentions and our dreams and our goals a reality. And maybe that's where starting as an engineer and then coming to this work maybe did pay off, because I kind of think in terms of those practical systems.
Yeah. So now we have just like a really fun lightning round to get to know you a little bit more. But I love the stories that you shared, because I think it does give us a flavor into like what you've experienced and then what you've created in your business. So, coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Beach or mountains?
I knew you were going to do that one. I have to go beach, but man, I do love both. It's got to be beach. This season of life, I need the beach more.
There you go. There you go. You can always change your mind.
Yeah.
Morning or night?
Ooh, used to be night and now it's morning.
That'll happen with kids for sure. Texting or calling?
Okay, I'm big on Voxer, so can I go in between? Voice text.
It's kind of a hybrid, right?
Love the hybrid. You kind of like hear the person, but you don't have to just sit there on the phone for an hour.
Yeah. All right. And last one, vacation or staycation?
Ooh, I would have to, again, right now, go vacation. Vacation to that beach, please.
There you go. Is there any last parting words you'd like to share with anybody, or anything, we didn't talk about that you feel compelled to share?
Well, yes, I'll make a little plug. So I'll give you a worksheet that can kind of help people figure out the stuff we were talking about with some norms. But you and I were talking about this, and it might be worth mentioning. There's a project we're working on, and you might have some involvement. It's based in Richmond, Virginia, although there might be multiple locations, but it's called Lost Office. And the idea is all the stuff we're talking about, creating a physical space where teams can come and experience and practice some of these better vibes and ways of working together. And so I'm really excited because it's just launching. I'm even more excited to keep chatting about it with you because we both have similar projects going on. And I think in this world of hybrid, I know you're getting the questions, I am too, about how do we do hybrid? How do we come together? Do we need to come together? And I think we both believe it's important in some kind of cadence to be together in person. And there's value that comes out of that you can't get online. But I actually think it's an opportunity, because then if it's not all the time, we're going to try harder to make it better.
Yeah, it goes back to like the intention, right? The intention of the space. And I got a little tour before we started recording, but the intention of the space is so important and creates like the magic of the vibe. And physical space is so important on creating a feeling or energy to create great and meaningful work.
Yeah, I agree. And even if it's just you and your team picking some place and getting together there. It's like an accelerated amount of progress you can make to have that in-person time together where you're kind of curating it and you're thinking intentionally about this stuff and you're talking together about what do you want to build together and maybe change. So obviously that could be a whole other podcast we could do, but I want to make that plug because I think it's important for people right now to be thinking about that and to explore not just what does hybrid look like in terms of the virtual meetings we have or don't, but also how can we use this opportunity to rethink our norms as a culture.
And I can't wait to continue the conversation of what Work Vibes and Lost Office can do together, because I think together we can do so much more than individually. And so I'm just excited about the opportunity to continue the conversation.
Oh my gosh. I love what you guys are doing.
Lostoffice.com, is that what the website is?
Just .co, lostoffice.co.
And we'll put it all in the show notes, but I think it's important for people to go check it out because it's really, really cool.
Yeah. And I'll also plug that you came on our podcast so people can check that out too. Or do you ever share your tool on your podcast here? Your 75 Vibes?
Yeah, 75 Vibes is on day 42 of 75 for the last part of the year. So it's hard to maintain something on a daily basis, but it's definitely worth it because it's the small things that make the big things happen. So
it's such a rewarding process. That's really cool. Cheers.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to share all these resources with everybody and get people just really started on the right foot, doing the things that matter the most and will have the greatest impact, but are super simple and don't require a whole lot of big team or a big budget or anything like that. I think these things are so simple, yet so impactful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Steve and I had the pleasure of connecting a few times before we met for this podcast. Steve is up to some really cool things, and it was awesome to hear his journey to how he realized the connection between individual purpose and organizational vibes. The key takeaway for me was how Steve talked about implementing team norms to create the right work vibes. The 3 norms he's using in his coaching practice of weekly sprint planning, calendar blocks, and one-on-one meetings for feedback, delegation, and development are so simple, yet seemingly so effective. In addition to the process norms, we briefly began a discussion on his newest project, which creates a physical environment with awesome vibes called Lost Office. I cannot wait to continue the discussion on this. If this episode inspired you and you want to see how you can take the next step to creating a better vibe within your organization, I'd love for you to download our complimentary 75 Vibes worksheet. This is a simple tool to create a habit and mindset around creating great vibes in work and life. The best part, it's simple and it works.